Shabbat Sholom. Like we were explaining last night, this week is a very interesting week in the Jewish calendar. It has Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut. We came off observing Yom HaShoah. And this Torah portion of Kedoshim really touches upon some of the most important concepts in Jewish theology. And when you actually put together Kedoshim with a calendar, it definitely makes you think about what the Torah had in mind for the Jewish people, what holiness really means, and how one actually achieves holiness in this world. And you have all of the concepts in the Torah, right? In front of a blind person, you should not put a stumbling block. Lifnei iver al titen mikshol. You have to rise when you see somebody that's older than you. By the way, if you've ever been in Haifa in the Carmelit, that it's not a subway, but it's just like an inclinator. It goes up the Carmel mountain. They actually use the biblical verse, mitnei seiva takum. If you see somebody elderly that doesn't have a seat, get up and give them your seat. So only in Israel do you see all of these verses from Kedoshim all over the place, trying to help people behave ethically and civilly. There is, however, an underlying current in this Torah portion that being holy is not something that you are given, right? We are not holy because God chose us among the people. We get up here, we get an aliyah to the Torah, asher bacharbanu mikol amim, that you chose us from all the peoples, right? Actually, the constructionist movement changed the bracha, and they say, asher kerbantanu lavodato, that we selected God to worship God. But we in traditional Judaism, we believe that God chose us. We believe that we're chosen. However, that doesn't mean that we're automatically holy or automatically better. It means exactly the opposite. God chose us to tell us that if we want to be holy, and we should be holy like God, we have to work very hard at it. And if you ever saw The Fiddler on the Roof, and you remember that master scene by Tevye, played by Topol, where he says, I know we're the chosen people, but can't you once in a while choose somebody else? That should ring a bell, because that's exactly how the world feels today. Right? If you have been a fly on the wall in the world in these past couple of months, it really feels like telling God, come on, choose somebody else. This enough is enough. But I have to tell you, we are just in the midst of something that happens every so often. We're not special, we're not unique. It had to happen at some point. It happened to our ancestors. It happened to my grandparents. Why would it not happen to us? What makes us so special that it wouldn't happen to us? I want to share with you a story. About 22 or 23 years ago, I don't know exactly, I was very new here in Las Vegas, and I got an invitation from something that was called the International Board of Rabbis. And I was the president of the Board of Rabbis here that we just had formed. So they invited me to a rabbinic trip to France. And we were going to go to Paris and meet with the Minister of the Interior, in that time Sarkozy, who then became Prime Minister of France. And we were supposed to do an inquiry on anti-Semitism in Paris, which, funny, when you look back, who's going to do an inquiry on anti-Semitism in America today, right? So we went there as the experts of living in the free world where there's no anti-Semitism. And we show up to France, and we are invited. By the way, another fun fact about this trip, I was there with Rabbi Mel Heck, also from Las Vegas, which was interesting enough. I found myself walking across the Champs-Élysées one night at 1 a.m. with Rabbi Heck, and it was a very interesting experience. But before that happened, we were invited to dinner by the European Conference of Christians and Jews. And the dinner took place at the headquarters of UNESCO. UNESCO is in Paris. And if you do not, UNESCO, together with the UN, is one of the most anti-Semitic organisms, organizations, or whatever you want to call it, in the entire world. It's a spin-off of the UN, so of course it's going to be anti-Semitic, but it's in its own right, it's anti-Semitic. So the dinner was in the last story of the UNESCO building, which is made entirely out of glass, so you can see out towards what's underneath. And we're sitting there at this table, and I kid you not, there were like 2 or 3 rabbis in the table, and the rest were French priests. It was very interesting. Most of them spoke English. A couple of them spoke Hebrew. They had been in Israel. Also there was Jean-Marie Lustiger, who was the Archbishop of Paris, who was actually in the short list to become Pope in those days. Now he has died since. And who was born Jewish. He was actually born Jewish and was given to a monastery to care for during the Holocaust. And he decided not to return to Judaism, and he became the Archbishop of Paris. It's a very interesting story. So right there is an unusual experience. And then the kosher food came out. And I have to tell you, I like food. Let's not kid ourselves. And it was the best food I've ever had in my entire life. I was having authentic French food in Paris, kosher. It was amazing. The only thing missing, of course, was the escargot, which we cannot have. But everything else was incredible. The wine was the best. By the way, I witnessed for the first time in my life, the waiters, which by the way were all Muslim waiters, again, another one of those things, were all waiting on us with white gloves, and when they poured the wine, they switched the gloves they were wearing, put up another pair of gloves, and then poured the wine because it was non-mevushal. And the rule is that if the wine is not mevushal and it's going to be poured by a non-Jew, they have to be wearing gloves that they put on specially for pouring the wine. Again, unusual. Then one of the priests sitting at the table says to me, "You know what happened in the park below?" So we're literally sitting by the window. I looked below and there's a park. And I said, "No." He says, "That is a park where Captain Alfred Dreyfus was stripped of his rank." So now this was really out of the Twilight Zone. Surrounded by priests, eating kosher food in the building of UNESCO, with the Archbishop of Paris, who's Jewish, looking straight down at the park where Captain Dreyfus was stripped of his rank after being declared a traitor by the French. Wow. What a page out of Jewish history. For those of you who are not familiar with Alfred Dreyfus and his story, in 1894, he was a captain in the French army that was put on trial by the French army for treason, and he was Jewish. And he was found guilty and he was stripped of his rank. Now, that wouldn't be unusual in Europe, except for there was a captain in the army that was Jewish, in the French army. That was unusual. And the French prided themselves in being this enlightened nation, but still, of course, not enlightened enough. And the most incredible part of the trial was the young journalist who was covering the trial. His name was Theodor Herzl. And Theodor Herzl, after witnessing firsthand what was happening in the trial and reporting back, he became convinced. By the way, he was a very assimilated Jew. But that trial and what he witnessed changed him. And he became convinced that the condition of the Jews in Europe and the world could not be sustained without a state of their own. That is a trial, the Dreyfus trial, that caused Herzl to become a Zionist, to write the Jewish state, and to ultimately pen the famous words, "Im tirtzu ein zo agada," if you will it, it is no dream. 1906, by the way, Dreyfus was exonerated of all the charges for a number of reasons. Because Herzl had really made it his mission to prove to the world what had happened, but also because Zionism was becoming a force of its own. And it was becoming clear that the need for a permanent state of the Jewish people was not a dream, but a necessity. And many people joined Herzl in clamoring for the state, from different backgrounds and different theological persuasions, They all wrote and wrote and wrote about how important it was. And eventually people began moving to the land of Israel, way before the 30s, way before the Shoah. We had always been there, but now we were coming back. What I really want to say to you is that what's happening in the United States today, it's our Dreyfus moment. What's happening in college campuses, the protests that we are seeing, the turning of its back of the administration on the Jewish people. This is our Dreyfus moment. It is. If the world is trying to convince us that Zionism should not exist, they're doing exactly the opposite. If the world is trying to tell us that we shouldn't defend ourselves, they're doing exactly the opposite. It's exactly what happened to Herzl. At one time, all combined in a single place, in a single country, we begin to understand that Israel is not a luxury, it's a necessity. There's a beautiful story about the Klausenberger Rebbe. The Klausenberger Rebbe, Yekutiel Yehuda Halberstam, was a very famous rabbi. He died in 1994. He was born in 1905. The Klausenberger Rebbe was sent to Auschwitz with his entire family. His 11 children and his wife were murdered by the Nazis. He survived and was able to move to the United States and rebuild a Hasidic dynasty. Later on, he moved to Israel, to the city of Netanya, where he actually founded the Laniado Hospital, which is a very famous hospital in Israel. He was really a powerhouse, the Klausenberger Rebbe. But when he was in his 30s and he was in Auschwitz, the story is told, and it's a documented story because many people witness it. It's told in different ways, but the story that I learned, the way I learned it, he was pulled by an officer in Auschwitz, and he was pulled by his beard. And then they started pushing him around, and they said, "Tell us, do you really believe you're the chosen people now?" And he didn't answer, so they pushed him around some more. And they took scissors to his beard. And they said, "Do you really believe you're the chosen people now? Answer." And he said, "Of course I do." And then one of the soldiers took his rifle and hit him in the head, fell to the ground. "How about now, you idiot? Do you still think you're the chosen people?" He replied for the second time, "I certainly do." And they started kicking him until he had blood coming out of his nose and his mouth. And they said to him once again, "How about now, you fool? Do you still believe you're the chosen people?" He looked up at the Nazis and said, "As long as we're not the ones raping, murdering, burning babies in the ovens, and killing pregnant women, we're still the chosen people." Shabbat Shalom. Let us please rise. Page 184, the Chatzi Kaddish for Musaf.